What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video. Now, this video is going to be a complete and comprehensive guide to pretty much every potential trade target that the Blazers could get with their $20.8 million CJ McCollum traded player exception. Hopefully this is a video over the next few days. If you're wondering who fits under that traded player exception, you can come back and visit this. There's only 9 days until draft day, so things are about to ramp up. Not much more time before the draft kicks off. We will be live streaming the draft on June 23rd, complete with special graphics that we'll make for it, so hopefully you're able to catch us on the 23rd for the draft. Now, I've been trying to upload a mock draft with trades, and I keep going back and changing the trades. I've already spent like 6 hours on this video, and I haven't even started the graphics or recorded it yet, but tomorrow I'm going to try and get this mock draft with trades out for you guys that I've been talking about the past couple of days, and then there might be a final flurry of draft profiles. I still don't know how many I'm going to do, but there will also be draft targets with the Blazers early second, and then draft targets with the Blazers late second round pick, and I'll have a lot more draft content coming up over these final 9 days until the NBA draft. Now, before I jump into the video, let me quickly try to explain what a traded player exception is. A traded player exception is created when you make unbalanced trades in terms of the salary that you're trading out and the salary that you're bringing back. If you trade out $20 million of salary in one player and get back $10 million of salary for another player, that's a $10 million difference, and you get a $10 million traded player exception. How they can be creative is a little bit more nuanced and complicated than that, but that is the general gist of it. The Blazers, by trading CJ McCollum, created a $20.8 million traded player exception. And what a traded player exception does is it cancels out incoming salary that is less than that amount, or up to $100,000 more. Now, if you're over the salary cap, you have to match salary in a trade, which means that you have to trade back a similar amount as you're bringing in. The general rule is 125%. The general rule is you can take back 125% of what you're trading out. So if you're trading out $20 million, you can bring back $25 million. Traded player exceptions come in handy because they are used to cancel out incoming salary. So if the Blazers, with their $20.8 million traded player exception, are trading for a player making $20 million, that trade exception, or TPE, cancels out that $20 million, and therefore the Blazers technically are bringing back $0. Therefore, they don't have to trade anything out, and they can acquire a player without having to match their salary for up to $20.8 million. So this video is looking at players making between $10 and $20.8 million that could fit into that TPE. I'm not going to propose a specific trade or anything because the Blazers technically don't have to send out any players, and it's just going to come down to what sort of value does the team want, probably in terms of picks, and if it's a good enough player, then maybe they want a young guy back as well. Now, the Blazers created this $20.8 million TPE at the deadline, in part because they traded out Larry Nance Jr. The Blazers traded CJ McCollum, Nance, and Tony Snell for Josh Hart, Thomas Satoransky, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and Didi Louzada. The way the trade ended up being structured is Nance plus Snell was about $12.5 million of outgoing salary, roughly, and that ended up matching both Josh Hart and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Those guys combined made about $15.5 million. That's within the 125% buffer for matching salary. So Nance plus Snell matched Hart plus Alexander-Walker. The only pieces left were CJ McCollum going out and Thomas Satoransky and Didi Louzada coming in. The Blazers canceled out Didi Louzada's salary as they had a trade exception that they got from the Gary Trent Jr. trade, the trade deadline prior. So it was essentially CJ McCollum being traded out for Thomas Satoransky that created the TPE. Last season, CJ McCollum was making $30.8 million. Thomas Satoransky was making exactly $10 million. Do the subtraction, and that's how you get a $20.8 million TPE. So that's in case you were curious as to where exactly this came from. Now, let's jump into the targets. The first one is obvious. That's Jeremy Grant. We've talked about him a ton. Say what you want about not overpaying for him or what you'd be willing to give up for him, but he is obviously the clear-cut target for the Blazers with this traded player exception. season. This season, he's making $20 million. Once free agency starts, it's up to about 20.9. But as I said earlier in the video, the Blazers can bring back $100,000 more than the TPE, so it still actually barely fits. Regardless, a trade would happen probably before free agency. It'd be surrounding the Blazers' 7th overall pick. If they trade for Jeremy Grant using their 7th pick, I expect them to trade down first and get some additional value. Who knows what they do with that value, but I think 7 is an overpay. Regardless, this is a great way for Detroit to get off salary and clear some cap space, as they wouldn't have to take anything back. Portland wouldn't have to match salary with this TPE like other teams would. The second target that's been talked about a lot is OG Anunoby. He fits a little bit easier. He's making around $16 to $17 million a year, and he would be a great get as a 3-man that is a really good on-ball defender and still very young, around 24 years of age. Now, it would be hard to get Anunoby. It would take a lot to pry him off of Toronto, but there has been some rumors that he's unhappy with his role, so maybe the 7th pick for Anunoby straight up would be a trade that satisfies both parties. The Raptors get $17 million of savings, the Blazers use their TPE and get a player at a position of need that's a good on-ball defender, which they need as well. That's why OG Anunoby has been talked about a lot as well. Now, after this, we're going to get into some more unknown targets, so to say. Some of them have been talked about, but they're just not as commonly talked about as Jeremy Grant and OG Anunoby. The next one is Miles Turner from the Indiana Pacers. I'm not thrilled with the idea of getting a center. I would rather just bring back Nurkic. If you bring back a Miles Turner, I think it's pretty clear that Nurkic isn't coming back because he could still start somewhere else. And using assets to get a Miles Turner and then letting Nurkic walk so you lose him as well just doesn't seem smart when we have glaring holes at the forward positions. However, Miles Turner does fit into the TPE with an $18 million contract. He's been talked about as being available via trade for years. I just, until the Pacers trade him, I'm not going to think that the Pacers are trading him. It's much like the Blazers in previous years with CJ McCollum. The next target is also a center, and he isn't talked about much, but he might be a throw-in into a bigger trade package, and that is Clint Capela from the Atlanta Hawks. He's making around $19 million a year over the next 4 years, and if for whatever reason, if the Blazers aren't confident in bringing back Yusuf Nurkic, then maybe they can get Clint Capela. I wouldn't want to give up assets for Clint Capela. The Blazers don't really have like a late first or anything to give up for him, and you'd be saving Atlanta a lot of money, so I don't think it should take that much to get him because they have Onyeka Okongwu, a previous top 7 pick in the draft. I forget where he was drafted, but he's a very good young project big man for them. The obvious thing is that Clint Capela could be included in a John Collins trade. John Collins makes a little bit too much for the trade exception. He's making about $23 million. The trade exception, as I said, can only absorb salary that's less than that. Since John Collins is more, the trade exception can't have any effect on his contract, so you have to match salary. So the logical trade would be Eric Bledsoe matching John Collins, and then the Blazers use the trade exception to take on Clint Capela. And maybe you bring back Nurkic and bring Clint Capela off the bench and have actually both of them. Maybe that would be possible. Clint Capela is definitely a name I have to throw in there. Since we're on the Hawks, Bogdanovich is another name. He's making about $18 million a year. He's actually pretty cool with Dame, which is kind of one of the more surprise relationships across the league. I don't know exactly when they became cool or how that happened, but Bogdanovich, $18 million a year for a wing that is an okay defender and very solid offensive player and can pass a little bit. He would be intriguing off the bench. He's 6'6", so could play the 2 or the 3 in my opinion. The only problem is he's not a great on-ball defender, and the Blazers need to try and get better in that regard. But he could also be thrown into a potential John Collins trade, or honestly, I could see the Blazers maybe doing a straight-up trade for Bogdanovich on its own more than a Clint Capela. And depending on what Atlanta wants to do this year, maybe they want to clear some salary space, so maybe you could trade like a second-round pick, maybe the 36th pick for Bogdanovich. If, you know, Jeremy Grant doesn't pan out, if OG Anunoby doesn't pan out, that wouldn't be bad value at that point, so Bogdanovich is another target. The next target is Christian Wood from the Houston Rockets. He's the cheapest player that I've talked about so far in this video. He's making about $14 million a year. He is entering the final year of his contract, and he can play the 4 or the 5, but I think he's better at the 5, so I'm not thrilled with him as a target. I don't think he's that good of a defensive player. I think if you replace Nurkic with him, our defense doesn't get any better, and you'd obviously have to give up assets for Christian Wood. So I'm not thrilled with the idea of him as a target, but he does fit into the TPE. Very offensively gifted big man for sure. I just don't think he makes a ton of sense for the Portland Trail Blazers. And there's another Bogdanovich that fits into the TPE, and that's Boyan Bogdanovich of the Utah Jazz, who might be in a transition period. They've apparently fielded offers on Rudy Gobert. I don't know what their long-term plan is, but Boyan Bogdanovich could be a target. He's a solid team defender. I don't think he's that good on the ball. Offensively is where a lot of his value lies. He did have a bit of a down season last year, but has generally been around a 40% three-point shooter and can do a little bit off the dribble. He's a crafty player. He's a really good offensive combo forward that can play the 3 or the 4. I wouldn't want to start him, but he could be a 6th man of the year candidate off the bench, and he's making about $18-19 million a year. If the Jazz are just trying to get off salary and the Blazers haven't found a use for their TPE, maybe you could take him on without having to give anything up, since the Jazz would save about $18-19 million. As I said, they're in a weird spot. They are probably going to try and duck the tax next year. They were over it this year, so Boyan Bogdanovich could be a sneaky target. Jonathan Isaac of the Orlando Magic is another target. I'm not going to really give my opinion on him because he is a politically polarizing player, and I don't get into that stuff here. If you leave any comments in regards to anything political or anything not basketball related, I'll probably just delete them because this is a basketball channel. We talk about this thing. The thing is with Jonathan Isaac is he's constantly hurt. He hasn't proven that he's worth his price tag. He's a very good on-ball defender, but given his injury problems, I'm not sure he's going to be the same player. So I wouldn't want to give up assets of value for Jonathan Isaac, but he could help address the defensive issues, and his salary at $17 million a year does fit into the TPE. Another target that I wouldn't really want, but I'm going to list because he's a forward that would fit into the TPE, that's Harrison Barnes. I don't think the Kings are looking to trade Harrison Barnes. From all accounts, they're trying to get better this year, and I don't see how trading Harrison Barnes would help them get better this year. Barnes is an okay defender, but I wouldn't necessarily call him good. He can shoot the ball, but beyond that, it doesn't really provide a ton of offensive value as some of the other guys earlier in this list, but he's another guy that fits into the TPE. And then Will Barton of the Denver Nuggets, the former Blazer, also is a potential target at a forward position. I would rather have him than a Harrison Barnes type of guy because I think Barton's a little better of a defensive player, and he's a little bit better playmaker and slasher as well. Can also shoot the ball. The problem is he's been constantly injured, so he doesn't have a ton of value. If Denver is trying to pull off a bigger trade, however, or maybe trying to clear some salary, you could maybe get back a 2nd round pick or 2 with Will Barton given his injury problems, and if he's healthy, he could be a guy that could help you off the bench as a playmaker that can play the 3 and also play some solid defense. Now, the next section of this list are going to be guys that make a little bit less, that make about $10 to $13 million. Now, if you use the $20.8 million trade exception on a guy making $10.8 million, then you'd have $10 million left over. So using half of the TPE doesn't get rid of all of it. It just takes out that chunk and you still have whatever's left over. The first target is Kao Kuzma. He had a bit of a breakout season this year. Was very good offensively. Could be intriguing as a bench forward. I think it might be a little bit of a fluke, and I've never really liked the way he plays. He plays like he thinks he's a star, and he's just not a star. And I feel like in a playoff series, if you're relying on that dude to provide some offense, I don't know. I don't trust him on that end in the playoffs. And then defensively, I don't think he's a good defensive player. I think he's okay. He has some redeeming quality on that end, but I don't think he's a problem solver at that position for the Portland Trail Blazers. If you throw him in on like a Milwaukee Bucks team, then I think that's a really good fit. I think they need another shot creator, and defensively they're really good, so I think his defense would be absolutely fine. It's just a matter of fit for him, and Portland isn't as clear-cut of a good fit as some other potential destinations, but he's making about $13 million, so he does fit into the TPE. Kelly Ubrey Jr. of the Charlotte Hornets is making about $12.5 million. The Blazers went after him in free agency last season, but Charlotte came in over the top, providing a dollar amount that the Blazers couldn't match. Dame tried recruiting Kelly Ubrey to the Portland Trail Blazers, so I'm sure he'd still probably be interested in him. He's a guy that could come off the bench and really light it up offensively. He's an okay defensive player. A lot of these guys are just okay defenders. But really, he's just an offensive microwave. In 26 minutes per game last year, he averaged 15 points per game. That is over 20 points per game per 36 minutes. He had average efficiency, but when he got hot, he could change the flow of a game. So it wouldn't be a bad target. It would just take some value to get him, and I think that value would probably be better spent elsewhere. And that's pretty much the case for all the targets in this section. I'm just throwing them in there because they are potential options to think about. Kelly Olynyk of the Detroit Pistons also fits into the TPE. I think he'd be more likely to be a throw-in into a Jeremy Grant trade, or maybe you trade out Eric Bledsoe to match Jeremy Grant, and then you use the TPE on Kelly Olynyk and still have $8 million left over or something. Also, Bledsoe plus Justice Winslow, Didi Louzada, and Greg Brown III barely matches both Jeremy Grant and Kelly Olynyk, and that would save the trade exception for a potential follow-up trade after that, so he could be thrown in without it. His salary does fit. He would be intriguing as a backup center. I would rather have more of an athletic rim-running backup center behind Jusuf Nurkic just to provide a little bit different of a look, but if the Blazers can't get that, Kelly Olynyk would be a very solid piece because he can pass the ball, he can shoot the ball. Positionally, he's a really solid defender, just not a great rim protector, but offensively, I think he provides a lot of value. Defensively, I think he's a little bit underrated. He would be a $12 million trade chip next year. I think you can even play him a little bit at the 4 if you need to. I think him next to Trent Watford would be intriguing to watch. So Kelly Olynyk is, in this section, probably my favorite name, and that's simply because he'd probably be lumped into a Jeremy Grant trade, but he would also take less value to get than a Kelly Ubrey or a Kao Kuzma. Terence Ross is another guy. I don't like Terence Ross. The Blazers shouldn't go after him whatsoever. He doesn't defend well, and offensively, he's just inefficient, and the Blazers don't need an inefficient, high-volume scorer that doesn't play defense at a wing spot. However, his $12.5 million salary does fit into the TPE. Malik Beasley is kind of in the same boat. He actually is making about $14.5 million. I just wanted to throw him in this section because it's another guy that I don't really want. He can get hot from three, shoots a lot of threes, and shoots an okay percentage on them, but over the next 3 years, he's making about $15 million a year. I actually think he's a slightly negative contract, and the Timberwolves aren't going to value him like that. They didn't trade him at the deadline, and there was apparently some interest from the Boston Celtics in him, so I'm not a Malik Beasley fan, but he does fit into the TPE. And then the final name of this section is Doug McDermott from the San Antonio Spurs. The Spurs are in a weird state, so it's hard to say what they're going to do this offseason, but Doug McDermott could be available. He can shoot the ball, but isn't a good defensive player either. Doesn't help Portland with their defensive issues, so another target that I'm not a huge fan of, but whose $13 to $14 million salary does fit into the TPE. Now I have two names left, and they are negative contracts, so in my opinion, the Blazers, if they trade for either of these guys, and I don't think they will, but if they do, they need assets on top of them since they're helping these teams get off their contracts, and these teams don't have to take any money back for that. The Blazers should be rewarded with at least a first-round pick for taking on both these guys, and the two names are Evan Fournier of the New York Knicks and Davis Bertans of the Dallas Mavericks. Evan Fournier of the New York Knicks is making $18 million a year over the next 3 seasons, and he's a solid player. Averaged 14 points per game last year, shoots a decent 3 ball, wasn't too efficient from 2, but he's generally been an okay defender, so he would kind of come off the bench in a Bogdanovich role. I think he's just a little bit worse than a Bogdanovich, and I think his contract is a negative value at this point, so the Blazers should be able to get back maybe a future first, and maybe they can flip that for their own future first back from Chicago. And the only way I'd even consider this is if the Blazers completely struck out on their trade exception and had no other use for it, but at that point I would just rather save the trade exception for the offseason. But if you can get enough value back with an Evan Fournier, maybe you consider it. And then Davis Bertans is even worse. He's a much worse player than Evan Fournier, in my opinion, making $16 million a year over the next 3 seasons. And then the 4th season is a partial guarantee. I think it's about $5 million guaranteed. So he's on a terrible contract, had a huge dip in production after he got paid. He can shoot a bit, but his shooting numbers cratered. Outside of that, doesn't provide any value whatsoever. He's a 3-point specialist whose 3-point ball cratered after he got paid an enormous salary. That contract it's just a head scratcher to me. So he plays for the Dallas Mavericks right now. The Mavericks don't have a ton of future picks. They have the 26th pick right now. Maybe you can take on Davis Bertans and get back the 26th pick. However, if you're doing that, you're kind of killing your flexibility for the offseason, and considering how early that is in the offseason, I wouldn't want to waste the trade exception that early. I just figured I'd throw both those names in just to make this a full comprehensive guide of trade exception targets. Let me know who your favorite targets are with the trade exception. If I somehow missed a target, let me know down in the comment section below. I really enjoy reading your guys' comments, so definitely leave them. Also, leave a like on this video. It really helps me out. It's the easiest way to support the channel, so I'd greatly appreciate it if you hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'm out of here. I'll catch you in the mock draft tomorrow. Until then, as always, peace out. Go Blazers.